the big thing I wanted to kind of hit you guys with is what can I start to manipulate? What can I start to use today? What can I start to look into, and why, from an external influence standpoint, that maybe will make that hour at the micro level more successful, okay? And this is a big thing that prior to, say, the Poliquin Performance Education platform that came out, this is what was taught to Judd and I when we were still just athletes, just training, talking to Charles eons ago. And everything he talked about was pre, intra, and post-workout, either supplementation, this is what this will be initially, supplementation for the sake of increasing not only mechanical activation, the ability to move, load, but also psychological or neural activation so that we had the desire every single day to do the hard thing. Does that make sense? Like, it's not just enough to be recovered enough to train, but you have to have enough of the right things happening in your body so that you have the desire to do the difficult thing every day, right? And sometimes that difficult thing, it's not like, oh God, I have to go lift weights. It's, I've had 3 tests today and I have to lift at 4 o'clock. It's like, holy shit, I have nothing left psychologically, but I know coach has got us at 85% for triples in the power clean, right? And you're just like, okay, how do I get there? Well, you know, in 2021 bullshitville, it's a shitload of caffeine and a bunch of stuff that people sell for the sake of a sensation. But in real human performance, it's making sure that you have the adequate neurotransmitters in place through a proper diet initially, and then addition to supplementation that actually makes a difference. So when we started to break this down, with the focus 1 is activation, right? Things that you're doing to ensure that you have the best opportunity to have the most neurological connection and brain function to what you're doing training-wise, right? So when we look at this, I break it down as neuro drive, muscle drive, metabolic drive, okay? I keep it super simple. When I look at neuro drive, I look at things like acetyl L-carnitine, tyrosine, and caffeine, okay? So there's a lot of ways to be super fancy with supplementation to increase neural activation, that 1 hour window before you train. But these are tried and true neurotransmitters. Things like the doc had talked about, cortisol, right? Increasing adrenaline, norepinephrine, epinephrine, right? So and this is kind of nice that I can piggyback his information. He talks about the cortisol curve being on an uptrend as you wake up. Stress gets you up in the morning. Cortisol wakes you up to go hunt and feed yourself. It's a primitive mechanism that has never gone away. It's essential for us to be functional humans. Now, we may not have to hunt the woolly mammoth anymore, but maybe our woolly mammoth is that training session. So we want to do things to stimulate cortisol going into that training session. Cortisol is athletic, focused, productive. You don't want to live there, but you sure need it to get going in the morning and get revved up for a training session. So when we look at some of these neurologics, like tyrosine drives epinephrine, right? Tyrosine drives norepinephrine, adrenaline, caffeine. What does caffeine stimulate the shit out of, which is good and bad? Anyone? Bueller? Cortisol. Caffeine and cortisol are good buddies, right? So caffeine will do wonders to drive cortisol, right, which will get you focused for training. We know from studies that now are 30, 40 years old, caffeine will have a positive benefit up to 2% increase in maximal strength in the moment for a training session, right? It's why they banned it. They didn't ban it because it didn't work. The only reason they don't still ban it is because they figured out the metabolization of caffeine is so different from person to person, there's no way to actually test for it at the Olympic level, right? I drink a Starbucks as, you know, a Swedish northerner, and I'm going to be agitated for 4 hours because of how my liver metabolizes caffeine. Whereas another athlete could have a different genotype background, genetic heritage, and caffeine is in and out of their liver in 15 to 20. So I'm testing positive at the Olympics and they're not. So that's why caffeine is no longer a tested product, right? But it doesn't mean that it still doesn't have that incredible stimulation. Now, from a health standpoint, acetyl L-carnitine, because it passes the blood-brain barrier, right, as a stimulatory effect, we can use it to increase neurological health, but it's also a protective for degeneration of brain, right? It's Alzheimer's and dementia and some of these other things. It helps keep that at bay, right? Muscle drive. Now this is where we get into like L-carnitine and creatine, right? Creatine will hit a little bit harder in the next slide, but L-carnitine will actually increase the rate in which you metabolize glucose, and it decreases the hypoxic nature of aerobic training, right? L-carnitine has huge benefit to improving the metabolic function even of an athlete that has an aerobic component to their training. It will increase mental focus and drive to training, but it'll also starve off fatigue, especially as you start to get into heavy fatty acid oxidation, right? So that one is going to be muscle drive. It's going to increase the ability to do work. Creatine monohydrate. Creatine monohydrate was isolated in 1832. Some say 1835, but it's the same guy. He gets two dates, right? But it's been around forever. The thing that John and I talk a lot about is the fact that creatine is neuroprotective, right? So with all the crap that went on during the late 90s, early 2000s with the phosphagen days and the muscle tech days, where people were taking huge amounts and then getting poor training quality on the field, get dehydrated and having heat stroke, the only thing they thought that changed because it became famous was creatine. So they're like, it was creatine's fault this kid got dehydration and had to take him to the hospital. Not considering the fact that it was probably the other 22 hours where he didn't drink any water, didn't eat any food, probably had a poor sleep cycle, and the coach kept him out in 100-degree heat for 4.5 hours, right? And water breaks were a privilege and treated as a punishment. Remember that whole era, right? So they had to blame someone, so creatine got thrown into that. Now, all these years later, creatine monohydrate in particular, not only is it neuroprotective, but they've found that it protects the brain from heat stroke, right? So the very thing it got bastardized for in the late 90s, early 2000s, if they weren't using it, they probably would have had symptoms sooner, right? So that's something to consider. Metabolic drive, beta-alanine, CoQ10, and phosphatidylcholine. The phospholipid group is essential for healthy brain function, and it's also essential for making sure that you're protected and recovering from the hard driving demands of training. When I go back and then look at CoQ10, right? CoQ10 in studies has now been shown that taken anywhere from 400 to 600 milligrams not only repairs cardiac damage following a heart attack, but dramatically increases mitochondria function and the ability to be able to sustain hard driving effort, right? Simple stuff. None of it's flashy. You're not going to feel yourself using it. But not only does it keep you healthy as you age, but it also gives you the actual energy sources that you need to be extremely successful in the weight room and on the field, okay? And then moving back to beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is an interesting one. Who here has used beta-alanine consistently? Yeah, almost everybody, right? I always think of beta-alanine as the cousin to the creatine marketing cycle. So they were able to market the shit out of creatine. And creatine, because there actually was a functional response to the use of creatine, if you used a high enough dose, you would get what? Cellular water retention, increase in short-term strength gains due to the hydraulic nature of a muscle cell filling with fluid. And it had a similar, although benign, resemblance to steroid use, right? So if you used a significant amount of creatine over time, you would start to get that strength gain in the weight room that was kind of like being on a cycle of D-ball, right? So they started to market it that way. Beta-alanine, when it came along, the research was actually better for human performance, but the problem is it didn't give weight room-based athletes that same biofeedback, right? They didn't feel and swell, and Bobby Skinny Legs doesn't get on the scale and have it go up 5 pounds over the course of 4 weeks. But what it did do is it buffered lactate. Not only does it buffer lactate, but they started to find in studies in 05 and 06 that athletes that stayed on it from 3 to 4 weeks and try to keep the dose below the pins and needles, right? That was the big thing. I felt the pins and needles, it must be working. Nah, you just took a bit too much. So when you start to look at beta-alanine, The studies in 05 and 06 that were done with a wrestling team showed, and then eventually track athletes, that if they were hitting like lactate threshold at like 300, 305 meters running a 400 meter track, what it was doing is after the system became saturated, they were able to push through to say 325, 340 before they got the same amount of lactate sensation, right, hitting the wall. So as they're starting to crest that corner and really got shut down by it, well, the corner now has moved 30 meters, which means they're able to carry speed longer, decreasing time it takes to run the total race, making them a faster 400 meter runner, right? So if you extrapolate that out to athletics as a whole, it allows you to tolerate hard driving training, hit style training in particular, that is that 30 to 65 second window, and you're able to get more work per period of time, which if you go all the way back to what we said, if you can get more repetitions in over the course of 4 years, you're going to be more successful.
Is that, there was a time where a lot of track coaches use like a Tums to be like more acidic, or
right? So
is that kind of like the same buffer?
So carbonate. Yeah. So it's the same theory, but it's basically just not as effective, right? So the idea of using baking soda, which was the original, right? Using baking soda and water, drinking it buffers lactate to allow the athlete to not become so acidic so quickly. It absolutely works. And there's still coaches and athletes that use it. The problem is the gastral distress is so high, it's unpredictable. Beta-alanine, you're not going to shit your pants, right? I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's the conversation that really needs to be had. If you are, you probably had tons of pins and needles before and you probably took too much, right? So beta-alanine is going to do the same, but it's going to be much easier on the body. It's more expensive, for sure, but definitely easier on the body. When we move to the next phase, which is focus 2, this is kind of piggybacking again, intra, right? Things that you're going to use to affect the actual moment of training, flow states, things of that nature. When I think of flow state, I think of things that are basically brain protective. Ginkgo, phosphatidylserine, and bacopa, okay? These are herbs or naturals that you would use that protect the brain from stress. Things that allow, like ginkgo, we know increases blood flow to the actual brain itself, right? Allowing it to improve what we would think of as executive function. So we know that people that take ginkgo biloba can tolerate information better under stress, right? It's one of the reasons they also give it to aging brains is because of the increased vascular activity. But think of it this way. You're gassing your athlete, just gassing them, and it has to be done because they're an 800 meter runner. Or maybe it's a more complex sport. And when they're in the shit, you have to also communicate. The research shows is athletes that can tolerate more information under duress, which is hard to do, and remember it, have a greater consequence to remembering it when they're recovering in what we think of as like the programming state. So after the training session is done, all the stress hormones come back down. When they're relaxed, the brain starts to put the pieces together. It's like when you show someone how to play the piano, and when they're sitting there, they play it next to you as they mimic you. Then the next day, they can't play it at all when they're by themselves. And then like 2 days later, it's back because the brain has to put those pieces of information together. Okay, ginkgo helps that. Phosphatidylserine in particular, we just talked about this with Doc. It's cortisol resistant, right? So they know from studies, 600 milligrams a day of phosphatidylserine will inverse the testosterone cortisol ratio, right? So you will crush cortisol and drive up testosterone from phosphatidylserine. We also know that using phosphatidylserine decreases the buildup of cortisol and how it affects the brain over the course of the training session. Does that make sense? Okay. Metabolics, okay, still comes back. Beta-alanine. I can't talk about this one enough. It just doesn't get enough play. Anybody that's doing metabolic work and they want their athletes to tolerate it better, take beta-alanine. It'll do wonders over time, and it's one of those rare supplements where when you remove it from the athlete's exposure, it doesn't immediately go away. We know that creatine's drop-off points very quickly once you remove it from their diet. It takes a little while for beta-alanine to saturate, but on the inverse, it takes a little while for the beta-alanine to run itself back out again, okay? It stores very well. L-citrulline, again, it's a vasodilator, derivative of watermelon, okay? So L-citrulline malate is roughly the consumable dose of watermelon that you would have to eat to get that, I think it's 5 grams, is something like 5 kilos of watermelon, right? So, I've seen people try, but I'd recommend the supplement over it. That's going to be a natural vasodilator that's not going to compete with other things going on in terms of the training cycle. Like the problem with L-arginine, even though it is an effective vasodilator, one of the issues we have with L-arginine when we take it during training is the fact that it competes for growth hormone release. So they did all these studies that showed that L-arginine pre-workout increased the growth hormone by something like 300%, right? Which is pretty cool. But what the study left out is the fact that without taking L-arginine, typical growth hormone release during a training session was 300 to 500% regardless. But where L-arginine is actually really effective with growth hormone releases during your pre-sleep cycle. L-arginine before bed is fantastic as a natural vasodilator and an upregulator of growth hormone release. It's really beneficial, like up to the neighborhood of 500 or 600% improvement over non-growth or non-supplemented state, okay? And then of course, essential amino acids, BCAAs and B6. Everyone's crapping on those again on social media, but the truth is amino acids will and always have had a place with recovery of tissue. It's just basically ensuring that you're filling in the gaps that they may be losing out on. It's one of those mindsets where if you can control as many variables as possible, that it'll decrease the chances for the athlete's failure, right? So if you're like, hey, make sure you got your BCAAs, or especially it has to be a nice blend, not just BCAAs, but like EAAs or BCAAs, and you're like, make sure you're drinking those every workout. Is it really going to be the game changer? Probably not. But you know what it does ensure is that every day, 4 days a week, 5 days a week, they're getting branched chain amino acids and essential amino acids under your watch, right? Because if they're with you and they got their shaker cup and it has some product in it, you know that they're at least getting something done, right? From the neuroprotective standpoint. Focus 3, post-facilitation. We look at L-taurine, or taurine, right? Vitamin C and L-glutamine as my big 3 right off the top. Taurine in particular is neuroprotective, but also Dr. Serrano was once quoted as saying, an athlete deficient in taurine will not gain any muscle over time from their training. So it's a sign that the tissue doesn't have the necessary amino acid for recovery. L-taurine is also very good at dealing with stress to the heart, right? So if you have someone that's always got like AFib or some sort of issue or stress-related tachycardia, make sure that they're getting significant amount of taurine in that scenario to help cardioprotective, especially along with the CoQ10. The vitamin C, again, fighting cortisol, right? Vitamin C is one of the few that we were told about right from the very beginning from the US Olympic Committee, even though I'm Canadian, where our training group, going back even 20 years, were like, post-workout vitamin C suppresses the cortisol curve, right? So as cortisol is continuing to elevate post-workout, now we have to start to curve that and get it going back down into rest, digest, or rest or eat and sleep psychology. And we're trying to stunt that cortisol as quickly as possible so we can get back into an anabolic state of existence. Vitamin C still has an active role in that, right? And this is something that isn't very sexy, so it doesn't get a lot of attention. But athletes at the highest level are still doing post-vitamin C workout. It's super beneficial. It's also the reason why when we look at therapy clinics that can go 10 grams or above intravenously, because it doesn't get disrupted and cause stomach distress, up to 50 grams for most cancer burn treatment, we see a massive anabolic effect from that. We saw, and it's a weird example to use, but professional bodybuilders, because they're so finite in how lean they are, any sort of deviation typically shows up. And one of my clients that I had was like a natural Miss Olympia, so drug-tested Miss Olympia in her 40s. And she had trained, and then, yeah, she started dating my brother back in the day. So I was like, hey, have you ever tried intravenous vitamin C? So we introduced that. I didn't do it myself, but we sent her to a clinic, and that's the only thing that we changed the last 4 weeks. And she was, based on the past 6 years of competing, she ended up being 4 weeks ahead of where she thought she was going to be. Like, it just radically sped up. One, how it affects insulin and glycogen into the tissue, and the other is controlling cortisol from that hard, stressful training made her more anabolic and actually put her ahead of the curve, guys. When I worked with Ben Pekalski, same thing. That was a big part of his protocol going into the Mr. Olympia. L-Glutamine, obviously, L-Glutamine is going to be very good for the stomach health of the athlete. So, we're not going to get into the nutrition stuff, but a stomach that can't digest nutrition, it can't absorb micronutrients, can't uptake neurotransmitters, the whole system gets broken, right? It's like, it's like people talk about thinking with their stomach or a gut feeling. The reason we do that is because a lot of the neurotransmitters that we are using for mental function, it's all coming from the stomach. It's all coming from our digestion. If you have an inefficient digestive system, right, or, at the most complex level, like holes in the digestive tract and leaky gut syndrome, glutamine will help with that. It'll help heal and improve the immune system. And in doing so, will protect you from stress hormones, increase upregulation of the absorption of nutrient. All of those things are affected from the stomach. So if you can heal the gut and keep it healthy and keep healthy bowel function, you're going to have all your other issues start to iron themselves out, okay? And then obviously magnesium, L-theanine. Now here's what's interesting. Dr. Parsley Sleep Aid, all of this in the recovery section, almost all of it is in that supplement, right? And I don't know if anyone's used it yet at night. It should have been in your bags. I used it last night. Magnesium, in his supplement, biglycinate and oxide, right, are his two variations of magnesium in that product. Biglycinate has an incredible ability to pass the blood-brain barrier, right? So of all the different magnesiums in existence, they all kind of have different things that they're beneficial for. Like magnesium tetrate is really good for the heart, right? Magnesium biglycinate is really good for the brain, right? So you have to start looking at these things, if they're good enough for that type of product and what he's using it for. If you're not starting to integrate it into your recovery protocols, you could be missing out on a huge amount of how the system restores during your sleeping phases. And it's going to increase the rate in which you rest, right? It's going to make you a better sleeper. L-theanine as well, suppressant of the nervous system, increase of melatonin, increase of 5-HTP from L-theanine. All these things are going to upregulate restoration. The key to sleep is to be consistent with the routine, but also to sleep deeply when you do.